All right, for those of you that don't know, my name is Jeff Getting. I'm the Kalamazoo County Prosecuting Attorney. Thank you all for being here today. I appreciate your time. We're going to talk for a little bit about an officer-involved shooting in this case on April 4th of 2019. Thomas Verile, for the record it's spelled V-E-R-I-L-E, Jr., was shot, killed here in Kalamazoo County. This is an incident that took place on East G Avenue in the early morning hours, approximately 9:38 a.m. The officers involved in this were members of the Michigan State 5th District, Michigan State Police 5th District fugitive team. There's multiple officers that are assigned to that team. There were 4 officers who were directly involved in the shooting of Mr. Verile. Those 4 officers are Deputy United States Marshal Tony Casper, Michigan State Police Detective Sergeant Kevin Conklin, Michigan Department of Corrections Investigator Thomas Johnson, and Battle Creek Police Department Officer Andrew Horn. Obviously, the fugitive team is made up not only of members of the Michigan State Police, but also of other departments and agencies here in West Michigan. That fugitive team assignment is to make arrests of persons with warrants. In this case, Mr. Verile was wanted as a parole absconder. He had been placed on parole after having served a prison sentence with the Michigan Department of Corrections. The Michigan State Police fugitive team, as with many other agencies here in Kalamazoo County, throughout the state of Michigan, throughout the country, is not equipped with body-worn camera devices. There was no recording of the encounter between Mr. Verile and the fugitive team members on that date. Members of the Kalamazoo Township Police Department were present. They were not in the house. They were outside of the house in a supporting role. They did have body-worn cameras, but none of those devices recorded the incident itself. There is a record on those cameras of radio communications between the fugitive team and them, but not actual video evidence of this encounter. Mr. Verile, after he had been shot and after he had been shot, his body was examined by the Western Michigan University Homer Stryker School of Medicine, Dr. Brandy Shattuck, S-H-A-T-T-U-C-K, and for all of your information, if you sign the Freedom of Information Act request, you'll have a copy of this opinion, and so all of the names will be in there for your use. Dr. Shattuck examined Mr. Verile's body. In her report, she concludes the cause of death to be multiple gunshot wounds. She concludes the manner of death to be homicide. Mr. Verile suffered multiple gunshot wounds. There was a total of wounds. There are 13 entrance wounds. He was shot 13 different times. Also of note in that autopsy report is that there was no evidence of any other significant injury or disease. The cause of death was the multiple gunshot wounds. Toxicology tests were performed on Mr. Verile. There were both cavity blood tests as well as urine tests. Those tests were positive for several different controlled substances, including methadone, morphine, amphetamine, and meth. With regard to Mr. Verile, the background information in this case I think is very relevant in informing the police officers that were involved in their actions. As I said, Mr. Verile was wanted for a parole violation. He had absconded from the Kalamazoo County Parole Office. The parole violation warrant was dated March 13 of 2019. As I said, this incident happened on April 4th, so less than a month after the warrant had been authorized. Information from the Kalamazoo Parole was included on or included with that absconding warrant, included this language. It's quoted in the report as well. Be advised, he will run/fight and may be armed. Caution advised. There was also an officer caution warning in the LEAN system. LEAN is all Law Enforcement Information Network. Basically, that's a tool used by the police that records all of a person's convictions as well as status for open warrants, and as a way of communicating with police officers if there is reason to be concerned for their safety in dealing with someone because of their prior criminal history and because of what is known to law enforcement. There were 4 outstanding warrants for Mr. Verile at that time. The parole violation dated March 13, 2019, which included remarks that he was an absconder, and the offenses that he was on parole for: breaking and entering a building with intent, and also felony firearm. Felony firearm is a common way that we refer to a conviction involving a gun. If a person uses a gun or is in possession of a gun during the commission of another felony, that offense is felony firearm. The outstanding warrants for the parole violation, also there were 2 warrants for civil warrants for neglect of child. Those typically are references to a failure to pay child support or outstanding obligations in that regard. There was also a criminal bench warrant for failure to appear. The remarks in that failure to appear warrant make reference to the original charge of possession of a short-barreled shotgun. In addition to the open warrants, Mr. Verile was wanted for questioning in an ongoing investigation being conducted by the Michigan State Police. In that case, there was tools, motor vehicles, and firearms that had been stolen from a local address. Mr. Verile was a suspect in that, and the police were attempting to contact him to question him, in addition to arrest him on the outstanding warrants. His prior criminal history includes multiple convictions for misdemeanor larceny in 2013, a felony stolen property in 2014, 2 counts of felony forgery in 2014, felony burglary in 2015, and the felony weapons offenses in 2015. Mr. Verile had been sentenced to the Michigan Department of Corrections for 2 years on the felony firearm offense in May of 2015, and then was subsequently convicted and sentenced to the Michigan Department of Corrections for a 1 to 10 year period beginning in November of 2016 on 3 charges of breaking and entering a building. He was discharged from that prison sentence on parole in July of 2017 here to Kalamazoo. In looking at what happened on April 4th, you can't do that without also looking back at the contact that law enforcement had with Mr. Verile immediately preceding that. On April 2nd, the same fugitive team had attempted to arrest Mr. Verile at an address here on Fenimore Street in Kalamazoo. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, they had contact with him. He was in a car that was backed into the driveway. He was behind the driver's seat. Officers saw him, recognized him, and surrounded the car. The fugitive team identified themselves, directed him to surrender for arrest, surrounded the car. There was an officer on the driver's side, an officer on the passenger side. There was an officer on the hood of the vehicle. directly in front of the driver's side, directly in front of the steering wheel on the outside of the car. Mr. Verile ignored police commands to surrender. Instead, put the car in gear and fled. When he did that, he caused the officer who was on the hood of the car to have to jump away for his safety, the officer surrounding the car to have to leave. His actions that morning made clear to the fugitive team, in addition to all of the information they had about his prior history, the extent to which he was willing to act in a way that would endanger officers' safeties in their efforts to arrest him. On April 4th, officers had information to believe he was at the East G Avenue address. Early that morning, they went to the address, surrounded the home, made contact with the homeowner when she came outside into the backyard. The homeowner confirmed that Verile had been staying at that address, that he had been living in the basement. She confirmed that he was currently present at that address, and she gave the fugitive team permission to enter the home to arrest Mr. Verile. The house is an older, small ranch house. The basement is partially finished. One side is a living area where there's a bed, dresser, couch, chair, TV, things like that. The other side is a utility area. The fugitive team had cleared the upper floor of the house and then had gone into the basement in order to try and contact Mr. Verile and effect an arrest if he was in fact there. As you look at the house from inside, there's this narrow stairway leading to the basement. When you get to the bottom of those stairs and look to the left, this is what you see, the finished area. When you look to the right, it's a dead end and then a door. As you come off those stairs, you have to make a U-turn in order to enter the utility room. Inside the utility room is an unfinished area in this basement. It's small, it's cramped. It has those things that you normally have in that part of your home. There's a hot water heater, there's a furnace, and all the duct work. There's a washing machine and a dryer, there's a laundry tub, there's a stand-up freezer, and there's a lot of household items. Many of them piled on the floor, some of them on shelving units, several totes that have items in this small area within the basement, which is where this happened. The officers attempted to make contact with Verile from the top of the stairs. They yelled down multiple times, identified themselves as police, identified why they were there to arrest him, asked him to cooperate, to surrender himself, and had gotten no response. 4 members of the fugitive team who I previously identified went into the basement in order to search for Mr. Verile, and when they went into the utility room, that's what it looks like from the door. And you can start to see the stuff that is piled up on the right-hand side where that wall is. Immediately to the left of that door, you can see that there's lots of household items that are on shelves, on the floor, surrounding the hot water heater that you can see there. There's a piece of exercise equipment that you can see. That gives you an idea of what that room looked like when those officers went in. And to the right, you see these shelving units and a lot of stuff that's on the floor. Pieces of clothing, towels, blankets, all of that. Unknown to the officers when they entered that room, that's where Mr. Verile was hiding. He had curled up on the bottom of that shelving unit closest to the wall, underneath all of that material, and had pulled that pile of clothing over him and other items over him in order to try and hide from the police officers. As they searched that room, they cleared the left side of the room. They then began to clear the right side of the room. One of the fugitive team members saw Mr. Verile. There were loud commands shouted at him by each member of the team to surrender, to show us his hands. The officers are in a small, enclosed, cramped area. There's no quick way of getting out of there, especially with 4 persons having gone in. There just is not an easy way to back out of that room. They were shouting at Mr. Verile to show him his hands because his hands were covered. On April 2nd, he fled from them and endangered their lives by his actions. He was wanted on as an absconder on parole with a history of firearms. And he was covered, and his hands were covered, and he was on the floor. And he wouldn't comply with officers' commands to show him his hands. And then he started yelling that he had a gun. And he repeated several times that he had a gun. He repeated that he was going to kill himself. He repeated that he was going to kill the officers. His body was covered, his hands were covered. They started trying to pull the clothing away. They pulled him out from that bottom shelf. And he was on his back, leaning up, and the officers were yelling, "Show us your hands, show us your hands, show us your hands." And he was yelling that he had a gun and that he was going to kill them. And then he moved forward suddenly. He pushed his hands forward, covered underneath clothing or a blanket. The officers believed that he had a gun, and it was at that time that they fired. Each of the 4 officers that were there fired multiple rounds. There was a total of 17 rounds fired, 13 of which struck Mr. Verile and caused his death. Immediately after the shooting, the officers called for assistance. There was an emergency response team that was stationed close by that came. Life-saving efforts were made by the officers on the scene, by the emergency personnel that responded. Mr. Verile was taken to a local hospital where he was pronounced dead. The local police officers that were involved were from various departments, but we're all working under the jurisdiction of the Michigan State Police 5th District. That's located in Paw Paw and covers all of southwest Michigan. Because one of their officers was on the team, the 5th District did not participate in this investigation. The case was assigned to the Michigan State Police 3rd District. That's located in Flint, Michigan. They have no affiliation with any of the officers involved. They're completely independent of the officers on the fugitive team or the 5th District headquarters. Those investigators from the 3rd District responded to the scene, took control of the scene. They, along with the lab personnel from Grand Rapids, from the Michigan State Police, as well as The officers from the Kalamazoo Township Police Department were there, and Kalamazoo Department of Public Safety, who assisted with the crime scene investigation, conducted the investigation into this case. That investigation included obtaining statements from each of the four persons, each of the four fugitive team members that were involved in the case. Ultimately, I responded to the scene while the police were still there, so that I could see it for myself. I've done that in each and every officer involved shooting case in Kalamazoo County since I was elected prosecuting attorney. I want to get there and I want to see what they saw when they saw it. I've reviewed all of the investigation reports in this case. I've reviewed all of the lab reports. I've reviewed all of the video and audio that was recorded by members of law enforcement other than the fugitive team. As I said, they're not equipped with body-worn cameras. Ultimately, it's up to me to make a decision as to whether or not any officers involved in this case would be charged with a crime as a result of having shot and killed Mr. Verile. In Michigan, the law allows police to use force, including deadly force, in the performance of their job. They may use that degree of force that's reasonable under the circumstances to effectuate an arrest, and they can take reasonable action to protect themselves in the course of making that arrest. That action can include up to deadly force if the police have reasonable belief that they or others may be killed or seriously injured. Their actions aren't subject to the 20/20 hindsight that comes with the ability to look at the situation. Their actions must be judged according to how the circumstances appeared to them at the time they acted. Deadly force in self-defense is appropriate if a person has an honest and reasonable belief that they were in immediate danger of being killed or seriously injured. If that belief was honest, if that belief was reasonable, a person can act at once to defend themselves, even if it turns out later that they were wrong, even if it turns out later that Mr. Verile was not armed, and he was not armed. In deciding whether or not their actions were appropriate, all of the surrounding circumstances have to be taken into consideration, including the people involved, their relative strength, whether they were armed with a weapon, whether they had other means of injuring someone, the nature of their attack or threat, and whether the actor, in this case the fugitive team, knew about any previous violent acts or threats made by the attacker. It's also important to know that under the law in Michigan, a person doesn't have to prove that they acted in self-defense. It's the prosecution's responsibility or obligation in bringing charges to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that an actor did not act in self-defense. The United States Supreme Court has talked about police use of force in the perspective that I, as a prosecuting attorney, have to use in making decisions in this case. What they've said is, quote, "The reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, rather than with a 20/20 vision of hindsight. Police officers are often forced to make split-second judgments in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving about the amount of force that is necessary in a particular situation." I think it's fair in all of these instances, and in this instance included, that we look back at these cases of officer-involved shootings and that law enforcement used them as a tool. No one wants there to ever be even one more officer-involved shooting, and there are lessons that can be learned in looking back about what other actions could have been taken? Those are fair questions to ask in this case and other cases, and they're questions that have to be asked so that we can reduce the number of times we're here to talk about these cases, so we can reduce the number of persons that are injured or killed, so that we can reduce the trauma to the officers that are involved in these cases, because none of them come out of this the same way they were before they started. But in looking at whether or not someone should be charged with a crime and looking at whether or not someone is guilty of a crime, we can't look at it that way. We have to look at it the way the Supreme Court has told us to. The perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene. And looking at it that way, and looking at this situation in particular, and the actions of the 5th District Fugitive Team. Arresting an absconder from parole is always a potentially dangerous action. This situation was made more dangerous by Mr. Verile's lengthy criminal history, his prior conviction and prison sentence for a firearms offense, the warnings to the fugitive team that Verile may be armed, that came with lien, that came with the absconder warrant, the confrontation between Verile and the fugitive team on April 2nd, Mr. Verile hiding himself in that small, cramped location in which officers had limited ability to otherwise protect themselves, Mr. Verile's refusal to comply with the orders of the officers to surrender himself to arrest, the orders of the officers to show his hands, and then Mr. Verile's claim to be armed with a gun and his threat to kill the officers attempting to lawfully arrest him. The actions of the police at that moment, that Mr. Verile moved towards them with his hands covered, must be judged from, quote, the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene. It cannot be judged from the standpoint of someone who is not involved and who has the benefit of the 20/20 vision of hindsight. At that moment, in the cramped basement of the home, members of the fugitive team had reason to believe that Mr. Verile was armed, that he would shoot at them, that would cause them death or great bodily injury. And in fact, that's exactly what Mr. Verile was trying to convince them was true. The actions that the officers took were immediately necessary to protect themselves and each other from that danger. The seriousness of the threat posed, the need for immediate action, and the reasonableness of the police action is further shown by the fact that each of these experienced officers on the fugitive team fired their weapons multiple times. For those reasons, it is my decision as prosecuting attorney for Kalamazoo County that the members of the Michigan State Police 5th District Fugitive Team, including Deputy United States Marshal Tony Casper, Michigan State Police Detective Sergeant Kevin Conklin, who is now employed with another agency, Michigan Department of Corrections Investigator Thomas Johnson, and Battle Creek Police Department Officer Andrew Horn, were justified in their use of deadly force to stop the immediate extreme threat posed by Thomas Matthew Verile Jr. As a result, no charges will be filed by this office against any of them. So, do you have any questions?
Were the officers wearing body armor?
The officers were all dressed very similarly. They were all wearing tactical vests, all of them in body armor identified as police. They had identified themselves as the police verbally as well, repeatedly in the contact with Mr. Verile.
How difficult has it been to make this decision? It seems like there's a lot of information that you and your team had to review.
These decisions are always difficult to make. There is a lot of information there is to review, We want to make sure that we are doing this thoroughly. You know, a person was killed, and we want to make sure that we are looking at this from every angle that we can, but in the end, these cases come back to the same place, which is reviewing it and looking at it from the perspective of that reasonable police officer in that scene, and whether or not the actions that these officers took were reasonable under the circumstances. But there is a lot of information to review in all of these cases.
You said that the suspect was on his back and his hands were covered?
Yes.
Okay.
Initially, he was on that bottom shelf, which is, you know, an inch or 2 inches above the floor in those kinds of shelving units. And he's curled up, hiding underneath a bunch of clothes and other items that he's pulled over him. Once the officers see him and begin yelling at him to surrender himself, to show his hands, because of their concern about the possibility that he was armed, one of the officers then grabs Verile and pulls him from that shelving unit. He ends up on his back, partially leaning forward, covered, not in his face, but his body, his hands, covered and clenched together underneath the clothing and other items that were covering him. And it's when he then goes to further sit up that he moves his arms in a way, his hands in a way that appears to the officers that he's pointing a firearm at them, and they then shoot in self-defense.
How close in proximity were those other officers from him at that moment?
Only a few feet. Let's, you know, I'm going to just estimate it. I haven't, I don't recall what the measurements were, but they're within 5-6 feet of him, no more than 10 for sure. The utility room is small, cramped. Where they can stand between the furnace area and the wall and the shelving unit is a small area, so only a few feet away.
Where in his body was he hit?
Multiple places. There were 13 entrance wounds identified by during the autopsy, including wounds to anterior chin, inferior chin, left neck, left shoulder, another to the left shoulder, left anterior torso, left arm, left abdomen, right thigh, posterior right thigh, right leg again, and right hand. That's 13, and they're listed out in the report.
How much time passed from when the officers entered the basement to when the suspect was shot?
There was a couple of minutes between entering the basement, entering the left side and searching that and clearing it. And then there's a much shorter period of time between entering the utility room and making contact with Mr. Verile.
Were there multiple cases in that room? How long did the conversations between the suspect, I mean, is that something that happened very quickly?
That's something that happened very quickly. You know, these are, the Supreme Court described it as rapidly evolving, and that's really an apt description for what happens and what happened in this case. That period of time between see him, start yelling to show us your hands, grab him, pull him out, keep yelling, and him then being shot is a period of a minute, not 10 minutes. It's much quicker.
Were there any weapons found in the home? Obviously he was not armed, but was there any weapons in the basement, upstairs that could have possibly...
My focus was whether or not he was immediately armed or whether there was a weapon in that immediate vicinity that he would have had access to, and there was not. Whether there was another weapon within the house or garage is irrelevant to what we're trying to decide in this case, because it's not, was there a gun on the second floor that he couldn't get to? It's whether he was armed or the police had reason to believe he was armed there. I'll give you one more.
Oh,
Okay.
strike that, sorry.
No?
I mean, we talked to the father of Thomas, and he said, why didn't they call in a negotiator or a K-9 unit even? I guess I'll present that to you.
You know, I've met with Mr. Verile Sr. and other members of Thomas's family, including his ex-wife, the mother of his children. And we've had a discussion, and those discussions are I consider to be very private, and I'm not going to go into what we talked about. But those concerns that he's raised are exactly what I'm talking about, right? Looking back at this, you know, are there alternatives that the police could use? Is absolutely the right question to ask, right? Because nobody wants for this to ever happen again. That's not the question that we ask, though, here in determining whether or not the officers were justified in their actions in that moment, at that time, in that place, from the perspective of a reasonable police officer. Were they justified in firing their weapons? You know, I think that Mr. Verile is looking at this from a good place and saying, you know, what can the police look back at this, and I know that they do. Right? The police dissect their actions and the actions of this team and say, okay, if you were put in this same situations, are there alternatives here that you could have used that may have changed the outcome? But that's not, you know, that's not the decision that we have to make here. Is there something that we can learn from this incident that will aid the police in avoiding this kind of a situation in the future? Thank you very much for being here today. I appreciate your time and patience.